Okay, so let's just start with a quick review of the vocab terms from last week, which is what we would have started with on Monday if the room was not blazing, boiling hot. I don't know if you're familiar with a band called the Meat Puppets. They were a punk band from the '80s, but they had a song called "Lake of Fire." And I just couldn't get that song out of my head for hours on Monday, or yesterday for that matter, because they still haven't fixed our AC. So, all right, condition versus state.
Okay, so that was with the conditions of which they kept the slave in the state of slavery, like the argument whether if the conditions were favorable, then it was just to keep the institution of slavery. But then those that argued about the state of slavery were arguing that the idea of having other humans as property was morally wrong.
Yes, yeah, by condition we're referring to the material conditions under which slaves lived.
Right.
Excuse me. State is their legal status as slaves, yes. So what text would we attach this to?
I think I did Cobbett, the slave trade.
Okay, yeah, because Cobbett would very much be on the condition side of that, right? Yeah, it's like, well, they're being kept better than some English workers, so what's the problem, right? So yeah, he would certainly be on what Claude Meillassoux, the French anthropologist who formulated these terms in the first place, would regard as the wrong side of the arguments.
Right.
All right, the loud death drum. What is the loud death drum?
The loud death drum, that was I think Anna Letitia Barbell wrote that in 1811. She was talking about the sounds of war, I'm pretty sure.
But she's also relating those war sounds to something very specific. The loud death drum is a reference to what? During the Napoleonic Wars, who would go around England beating drums loudly?
What was it, was it the military?
Yeah, the recruiting sergeants, right? So so the loud death drum is a reference to the recruiting sergeant's drum.
I'm so sorry. I saw the thing when I had 5 minutes and I got turned around on campus because I didn't know where this was.
Yeah, Rylan was worried that you were lost.
I was.
She's a freshman. Does she know what building she's supposed to go to? But yeah, okay. So just a quick update, by the way. They got the part today to fix our air conditioning. They're probably dealing with it right now. So Wednesday, unless everything goes completely pear-shaped, we are going to be back in our regular classroom.
Well, it was up and running when I was there, so.
Yeah. Well, they came up with a temporary fix this morning. Like I walked in, I was really expecting to get just like step in from the hot blazing sun, walking here from my house. And then, it's going to be even hotter in the building, just brace myself. And then I stepped, hey, the air is moving. This is new. All right.
So the loud death drum was being by the recruiting people that were impressed during the impressment?
Yeah, exactly. They're going through villages, they're beating that they're beating a loud drum to try to entice recruits. All right, the Zong incident. What was the Zong incident?
When they threw all the slaves out the ship and then they collected the insurance money.
Yes. Now this did lead to the 1788 Slave Act, which limited the number of slaves you could transport. on a ship, right? Which was an incremental step.
Right.
But yeah, what text would we relate this to?
Thomas Clarkson, the essay on slavery and the commerce of the human species.
Yes, good. Yeah, Clarkson references this specifically, and it was his essay that got that Slave Act passed. All right, good. The public sphere. What is the public sphere?
Well, it's the physical and virtual spaces to where people of the community can come and talk about like civic issues.
Uh-huh.
So
Yeah.
like coffee houses,
Yes.
newspapers and pamphlets.
Mm-hmm.
An example of the public sphere was in Clarkson's committee, right?
Yeah, they're operating, or at least like the sorts of publications that they put out, and the kinds of the like debates and speaking events that they would host. These would be public sphere events, right? And you don't necessarily need to know this, but yeah, the guy who formulated this idea is the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas. I saw that one of you put in your answer, like, I think Tumen Habermas. I still gave you credit for it, but I imagine it was just difficulty reading your own notes or my handwriting, one or the other. Okay, impressments. What was impressments?
But, okay, so what would have been a text to reference the public sphere to?
Oh yes,
Clarkson, I think.
Probably, yeah. Any of the three really would have worked, right? Because like Cobbett's was a letter, but it was a letter that he published in one of his newspapers. Right. Coleridge was giving a public speech on abolition, right? And yeah, and Clarkson, Clarkson's committee published and distributed this pamphlet that discussed the Zong incident and painted this imaginary conversation on the coast, on the Gold Coast of Africa. So yeah, any of the three could work there. All right, impressments.
It was like conscription, basically, of soldiers. So like instead of you volunteering to be a soldier, you were forced to be one.
Yeah, and then this was like not quite like a draft, right? Where they're just kind of like drawing numbers out of the hat, and it's up. Your number's drawn, you're going to Vietnam, right? It's more like they actually show up in your village or hijack your ship, right? And say, congratulations, son, you're in the Navy now, and just pull you along with them, right?
That's awful.
Yeah. So what text do we relate this to?
Robert Southey's The Victory?
Yes, the victim that he talks about in that poem was impressed into service in the Navy, right? All right, good. John Bull.
Oh, that was the cartoon character
Uh-huh.
in Britain, and that was the one that we had like the whole scene of like when he was happy at home and then got like taken off and the family pawn all the possessions and everything.
And yeah, John Bull is this cartoon character who emerges in the late 18th century as like this kind of typical English countryman, right? And so what text would relate the John Bull's Progress panels to?
I think it's William Wordsworth, the discharged soldier.
Okay, yeah, you've got the soldier who's come home from service in the West Indies, right? And it's just kind of dropped off the ship and said, go find your own way home, buddy. Yeah. And he's kind of emaciated and probably diseased, and kind of wandering slowly. So I think that kind of lack of care for soldiers once they came home is evident in both that cartoon sequence and in Wordsworth's poem. All right, the Royal Africa Company.
That was the one that Edward Colston and a bunch of like really wealthy or prominent families invested in, and they would trade some things like gold and whatnot, but they also traded slaves, so it became very controversial.
Yeah, the major business of the Royal Africa Company, was slaves.
investors was like the royal family of Britain and
Yep.
Anglican bishops. And then
Yep.
The Caston and Edward Caston.
Yeah, so yeah, it was very much integrated into the power structure of Great Britain, right? Okay, so if we can attach this to a text. And again, there are a couple of decent answers for this. So.
I would say maybe Cobbett, because he was talking a lot about like the slave trade and trying to like say that it was something good, and then Edward Colston, like he was in the slave trade, and also like for the time being with all the money that was going to like philanthropic efforts,
Sure.
like people probably thought like there was it's the conflict between like the morality and the slave trade.
Yeah, and I think, we didn't really go into this, but he writes that letter to the Bishop of Rochester, who himself had interests in, financial interests in this, right? But yeah, I think you could probably also make an argument for Clarkson or Coleridge, or Equiano as well. All right, the church bells. Now we're talking about church bells here in a very specific instance. So what do church bells have to do with anything that we read?
They were in the Victory,
Mhm.
and it said something like how it stuns the glad ear, and like because it was celebrating the victory in the battle, but also like at the same time the bell was usually rung when like people died and at funerals, and like there was
So there's that ambiguous signifier there, right? It's like, yes, it's celebration, but also funeral. And again, remember how the church was connected to the state in Britain as well. So the ringing of church bells represents some kind of state occasion here as well as a religious occasion, right? And yes, it's the Victory, Robert Southey. All right, last two, sugar. Why is we all know what sugar is, right? Why is it significant for our purposes?
It was like one of the main crops that was coming into Britain during the Middle Passage, and all the people of Britain, they were enjoying it. Unknowingly about where it was coming from.
Yeah.
I say I do the air quotes.
I see you got the air quotes going there.
Because it had to be coming from somewhere.
And Clarkson and Coleridge both kind of like suggest to their audiences that you know where this is coming from, right? You know how we're getting this, right?
I mean, especially the people that lived in like Bristol and Liverpool, like those are like the main ports. So if you live in those cities, you gotta know that. They're trading those slaves.
Exactly. That the ship doesn't just leave with pewter mugs and come back with rum and sugar, right? They're making a stop along the way.
Right.
And there's a leg of that journey that you don't directly see, but and I think Coleridge in particular is calling for a sugar boycott, right? In his speech on the abolition of the slave trade, he's asking people to stop buying sugar in order to try to disrupt the trade, make it less profitable. All right, and finally, the longest term I will probably ask you to commit to memory, the Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade.
Yes, that was Clarkson committee, one that he helped found.
Yes.
So most members were dissenters. Like I said earlier, when we did public sphere, that was, I guess, one type of public sphere. Where they came and talked about the existence and the slave trade, the existence of slavery.
I think you got it. You pretty much covered it. Yeah. But I want to make sure everybody remembers as well. Like, let's just quickly go. What is a dissenter? Because this is a word that's going to pop up again.
They were Protestants who said that the king was not the head of the church.
Yes, a dissenter is a non-Anglican Protestant, right? Any Quakers, Unitarians, Baptists, all of these other denominations that are not Anglican. All right, good. Okay, so I did just do a little check in Georgia View to see whether y'all watched the Equiano video, and I saw that everyone did.
Yeah.
So good. And two things I want to do. First, I do want just to give you a couple of terms from that lecture that I want to make sure you know going forward, right? That are going to be important, may appear on quizzes or exams. So I want you to know what defamiliarization is. This is something we might actually talk a little bit about today with Wordsworth as well. I want you to know who the sons of Africa were. What the Middle Passage is. And what was the other thing I was thinking of? What a corresponding society is. And finally, remember the names Gustavus Vasa and Michael Henry Pascal. Actually, not finally. Also, remember what the talking book, the talking book episode. Okay, so do y'all have any questions or comments about the Equiano before we move on to Wordsworth? I know y'all are going to have questions about Wordsworth.
Yeah. Okay, so the talking book, I found that very interesting. Like he was, and like when I was watching the lecture, how you were saying how it was written, I didn't even wasn't aware of it, that it wasn't written in past tense when he was writing. So like, is there a reason like he was doing that specifically, like not writing it like that, like in past tense, and about the talking thing, like the talking with the books thing, like I don't know, I just found it interesting.
Yeah, well, I think my first question is of course going to be like, do you think there's a reason for that, and what do you think that reason might be?
Socratic, okay. Socratic.
You should be used to this one. This isn't your first rodeo with me.
Right. Okay.
So yeah, let's see. If we all go there, it's page 108. It's the short paragraph on page 108. Equiano writes very long paragraphs. And the thing that I would suggest you try to do, right, as you think about this and what it might mean, is, compare it to the episode where he talks about getting his face washed, and compare it, when he quotes the lines from Milton's Paradise Lost in, the final part of the excerpt here, right? So what he's doing there is showing, mastery of English cultural codes, right? It's like, I've read your books, I understand your culture, right? But so here we've got, this talking book thing, right? And he's still dismayed, even though he knows what a book is and how it works, right? He's dismayed that the book still doesn't talk to him. So we can think about this partly in terms of this defamiliarization we've been talking about, right? And how does defamiliarization work? What is defamiliarization?
It was like taking something known and mundane to the reader and then presenting it as something new, and it was supposed to appeal to other people's sensibility and creative process.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he's depending on the reader's sensibility here, right? Their sensitivity to if I describe what snow looks like, right, to someone who's never seen it before, they're gonna see and feel it through my eyes, right, and thus sympathize with my particular situation. And I think he's doing a similar thing with the talking book, right? He's defamiliarizing the notion of the book.
I mean, because at the point where he's writing it, he knows what the book is, he knows how
Yeah.
to read and write, and then I'm guessing he's assuming that the people that read this, they know how to read and write.
Right.
So, yeah, I guess like us
It's
being,
a safe assumption, yeah.
right. So us being, I guess he's inciting the reader to like, I guess, like you said, sympathize for him where he was at that point,
Mhm.
when he thought that, they were talking books and
Yeah,
he was
yeah.
talking back to them. So yeah, I see that now.
Yeah, it's a little like there's something that still doesn't, like, it's kind of like an acknowledgement that he's still, like, he cuts his hair, wears his clothes,
Right.
speaks in the manner of English people now, right? He, joins a Methodist church, so he is, following English religion. He marries an English woman. But it's acknowledging that there's still kind of like these, still not like a square, he's still a square peg in a round hole here, right? That the book doesn't talk to him the way it talks to native English people. That his ability to communicate with it is somehow more limited than theirs is. It's like he's never going to quite be a part of the same world.
Right.
So do y'all have any other questions or observations about Equiano before we move on to Wordsworth?
Okay, I was confused at one point
Uh-huh.
when it brought in Daniel Queen.
Yeah.
And like for a long time it sounded as if because Pascal was not in the picture at all. So I don't know, was he sold to Daniel Queen and then Daniel Queen sold him again?
No. So there's so part of the problem here is that we're reading excerpts.
Okay.
So there's a lot that happens in between, right? That so Daniel Queen is a fellow sailor on the ship on which Equiano serves, right? And I think one important thing to note here is that going back to the whole condition and state thing, right? Generally, conditions were for slaves were better at sea than they were on land, right? If they were a slave on a ship, right? If they were owned by, say, a ship's captain or a ship's officer. Because everybody had to do the same kind of work. It was a slightly more egalitarian world. Everybody ate together, everybody bunked together. Even on shore, slaves who served on ships were given relative freedom, right, compared to their land-bound brethren. However, they did have to do one thing that a lot of their free brethren didn't have to do, is they had to look out for people who were going to try to Shanghai them and take them off to plantations. However, one thing that I think Equiano was pointing out here is that even though his conditions are actually pretty good on this ship under Michael Henry Pascal, he's still constantly reminded in small ways sometimes in big ways, of his inferior state, right? So, when Pascal just gets it in his head to sell it, and, when he says, well, let me get my stuff, right? He's like, you don't have any stuff, you're a slave, and he waves a sword at him, right? Get in the boat. And then, all the other sailors promise to help him, and then they don't. So, yeah, Daniel Queen is another sailor who teaches him some useful job skills, basically. I think he teaches him how to cut hair, which was the thing that he did, that Equiano then did professionally when he was after he was freed.
Okay, that makes a little more sense.
Yeah. Mhm. Okay, so any other questions or comments about Equiano? Okay, then let's get to your questions and comments about Wordsworth, because I get the sense that this may have been a little confusing. So So let's turn to page 299. And I guess first I will ask you for your observations here so we can try to figure out where y'all are getting hung up. And by the way, again, I promise Stairway to Heaven is totally relevant to this poem.
Okay. I was looking for like an overall theme, but couldn't. Well, I could catch on to one, like maybe nature.
Okay.
A lot of nature things.
There's a lot of nature imagery, yes.
I don't know if it was intentional, but I saw like some biblical literature or
Okay.
Therefore thou art with me.
Uh-huh.
Or maybe that was just the jargon.
Yeah.
That he was writing in.
Yeah, and I think what you're probably noting there is jargon rather than direct biblical quotation.
Right.
And I think in part because like what you're hearing there, what you're reading is the language of the King James Bible.
Okay.
Which, if you were an Anglican,
He never was taught.
raised in Britain in the 18th century, the King James Bible was a central part of your education. So even if, like Wordsworth, you were not quite religiously orthodox, the cadences of that language still kind of stuck with you.
I thought it was really interesting at the beginning of the poem how there were a lot of references to talking or murmuring or quiet or seclusion.
Okay.
And then at the end of the thing, it was finally like as he was with his sister and then like talking about his memory and like what would she remember of him and kind of like, I wonder if he like was more talkative in his youth and then like became more thoughtful and was like, wait, now maybe I was the hermit who they were talking about on the first page or something.
Yeah, so that's one weird thing, right? Like until the very last page of the poem there, right?
He didn't seem to get excited when he was with his sister or thinking about his sister.
Yeah. Does he give us any indication before that there's anyone else with him?
No.
And the way he's using his sister in the poem is kind of weird as well, right? So we'll talk about that in a moment. We're actually going to read some of Dorothy Wordsworth's journals a little later on. And the relationship between the Wordsworth siblings is a little weird and codependent. So just a couple of things to note about that. One, they were orphans and didn't grow up together. So their parents died when they were quite young, and William was sent off to school, and as were the other boys. And Dorothy, who was the only girl, was kind of kept in the home of some relatives. Another thing to note, and this is maybe just kind of like weird, salacious rumors, but whatever, right? Sexual attraction is largely based on our sense of smell. And one of the reasons we are not typically attracted to our near relatives is that they don't smell attractive to us.
Right.
William Wordsworth had no sense of smell. So make of that what you will. But we will find, particularly when we read Dorothy's journals, that the relationship between the two of them is oddly intense for brother and sister, even if it's not necessarily a romantic or a sexual relationship. It will still strike you as strangely intense. But what's he using her to do here in the poem? Like, what seems to be her purpose here?
It's like restore a lost identity almost.
Okay. Yeah, which of the two of them has not been to this place before? So you got William and Dorothy, right?
I would assume probably Dorothy, since he said it was 5 years, since he had been there.
Yeah,
So
he's made this little walk before, right? He's been to this place before. So it's not new to him, right? It's not fresh to him. Dorothy hasn't. So if we look on page 301, can I get one of you to start reading from "For Thou art with me upon the banks"?
I will.
Yeah, thank you, Reverend.
Okay, so for thou art with me here upon the banks of this fair river, thou my dearest friend, my dear, dear friend, and in thy voice I catch the language of my former heart, and read my former pleasures in the shooting lights of thy wild eyes.
Okay, that's the part we want here, right? So what's he trying to get out of his sister here as he takes this walk with her, right? That he's done before, but that she hasn't. In thy voice I catch the language of my former heart, and read my former pleasures in the shooting lights of thy wild eyes.
Like, probably he's hoping she's as amazed with what she's seeing as he was when he first saw it, maybe?
Okay, yeah, I think that's a big part of the hope here, right? And what is all of this to her that it isn't to him? Yes. Yes. So what he wants to do, right, through watching her and her responses, right, is to recapture.
Like see it for the first time again.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. To see again what it's like to see this place for the first time, right? So, defamiliarization is a really common technique in romantic writing generally, right? Part of what writers like Wordsworth want to do is take everyday mundane things and try to make you look at them from a different angle or in a new light, right? And here we see him trying to wrestling with that concept himself as he and his sister take this familiar, this walk that's familiar to him, but not to her. And I think it's probably important to, let's maybe take a breath for a minute and go back and talk about what romanticism is and the context that it's coming out of, right? So how many of you talked about or read romantic poetry in high school at all? It was maybe mentioned, right? Okay. So what do y'all know then about romanticism? What ideas have you come to associate with this term?
If I'm not mistaken, from high school.
Mm-hmm.
I think nature was a big part of it.
Okay.
That's the only thing
Yeah.
I remember.
Nature being a big part of it.
That sounds very typical for the way this is taught in high school.
Right.
It's not actually technically correct,
Okay.
but we'll get to that.
Like most things in high school, not really correct.
Yeah, romantic poetry isn't actually about nature, but because nature imagery is frequently used in these poems, we tend to think that this is poetry that's about, the natural world somehow, right? Anything else that y'all know about romanticism or remember about romanticism from high school or from past classes? Or is this pretty much it?
They also made a note of making us know that it wasn't romantic feelings, it was more like fantasy.
Yeah. So the roman here is really kind of an abbreviation of the word romance, which is a reference. It's essentially what we called novels before we called them novels, right? So romances are medieval prose narratives.
I was wondering how that got that name.
Yep, this is how. The Romantics are often trying to hearken back to a kind of imagined Middle Ages. We'll see a really specific example of this when we read John Keats and the Eve of St. Agnes in a couple of weeks. But Coleridge is going to be doing some of this as well. And yet at the same time, so in going back to what they regard as the purity of an earlier period, what they're trying to do is react against some of the kind of strictures that they felt were placed on writing in the 18th century. By writers who we now refer to as neoclassical. So neo meaning new, classical referring to the civilizations of ancient Greece and Rome. And so neoclassical writers, did we talk about neoclassicism at all?
I don't think so.
Okay, all right. So neoclassical writers operated under a certain set of assumptions, right? One, that literature and all arts are crafts, right? That is, they are learned through practice and long and careful study, right? So you learn to become a poet by learning the rules of poetry, right? These crafts are rules-based. And by careful application of those rules, right? So when we read even the best neoclassical poetry, there is often a kind of sameness to a lot of it. It's almost all pentameter lines. It's almost all rhyming couplets, and they based everything on Greek and Roman models. Right, so they only wrote in genres that the Greeks and the Romans wrote in. So they write tragedies, they write epics, they write pastorals and elegies. They don't try. What they're really trying to do is again apply these more prestigious civilizational ideals to English writing, to try to give it more cultural prestige, right? It's highly formal. And the subject matter is usually human society or urban life, right? They're really into depicting humans interacting with each other in social settings. So romantics, on the other hand, tend to view art as a kind of visionary or inspirational pursuit. Right? You don't become an artist by learning the rules, right? You become an artist because you feel you feel some kind of vision that you need to express in verse or in prose or in painting or sculpture or whatever, right? So what you're trying to do is express your own inner life. It's based more, as we said, on medieval and folk models. Than on Greek and Roman models. And it's often structurally a little bit more loose. When compared to neoclassicism. And the primary subject of a romantic poem is thought. And I think this is where people get hung up on the nature thing, right? What a romantic poem is usually really about is the workings of the artist's mind, right? And many of the most famous romantic poems do follow a particular pattern. So the well-known literary critic M.H. Abrams, in 1965, wrote an essay called Structure and Strategy in the Greater Romantic Lyric. And remember this term, greater romantic lyric, right? Because this is something that we're going to apply to Wordsworth and that we're going to be coming back to as well, right? So what Abrams argues is that most romantic poems follow a kind of three-part structure that I'm going to sort of shorthand here as outside, inside, outside. So outside part one is usually a description of the poet's immediate physical environment. Right? This is where I am and what I am doing. Right? I am walking along the River Wye on the Welsh border, and I am looking at things, and these are the things I am looking at. This is why we tend to think romanticism is all about nature, right? Because a romantic poem usually starts with observation of nature. But nature is only important as a catalyst to thought. And really anything else can serve that purpose as well, and sometimes does. So that's the inside part. The poet meditates on his circumstances, or her circumstances. Most of the well-known romantic poets are men, but not all. And then that meditation is related or applied to some outside circumstance. Right, so we get this kind of change in views or address based on this meditation. Bless you.
Thank you.
Or really kind of like application, right, of that meditation. And this is what the greater romantic lyric basically looks like. And Abrams based his description of this structure on poems like Tintern, Abbey, right, which follows this pretty much to a T, right? We start with Wordsworth's description of the Wye River Valley Walk. And then he starts thinking about, his boyhood and what he was like way back when, among other things, right? He also has a few ideas about art, psychology, and aesthetics that get mixed up in all this. And then he applies the results of these meditations, right, that I cannot recapture what I was like when I first experienced these things, to his sister and to her experience, right? Hello, conveniently present outside person. Let me relate to you the results of my long meditation. Well, I mean that's kind of what she is in the poem, right? She's there largely as a matter of convenience rather than as a kind of real developed character. And this is my parents and a lot of other baby boomers really love this singer from the 70s called James Taylor. And James Taylor always irritated me because every James Taylor song is about James Taylor. Wordsworth has always kind of irritated me a little bit for the same reason, right? Every Wordsworth poem is ultimately about William Wordsworth, even if he's trying to make it about something else. But like, is this starting to make a little bit more sense to you now? Now that you can see the structure and, okay. So let's kind of, go ahead, Riley.
Especially with the use of his sister now, I can now understand that, yeah, he introduced this other character in the poem, but it really wasn't to introduce her as like a separate character for his own personal use.
Yeah. What matters for him about her is how she reflects his own past attitudes, right? This is what's important. This is what she's here for. Friggin' Wordsworth. All right, so let's go to the beginning of the poem, and let's see if we can kind of like trace these movements here. And then I'll if we have time, I'll tell you a little bit more about kind of like the cultural circumstances surrounding this. Some of that stuff might have to wait till Wednesday when we talk about Coleridge. One thing I do want to note is that this poem and The Rime of the Ancient Mariner were published together in the same book in 1798. It was a joint volume, originally anonymous, called Lyrical Ballads. Wordsworth wrote about 2/3 of the poems and Coleridge about 1/3, although Coleridge's poems were significantly longer than Wordsworth's. But initially they did not, they wanted it, they wanted the book to stand on its own and not as even like the work of any individual authors. So they didn't sign it, and they didn't sign any of the poems. So it wasn't until subsequent reprints of the volume that anybody knew which poet had written which poems. In fact, some of the there are parts of Wordsworth's poems that were written by Coleridge and parts of Coleridge's poems that were written by Wordsworth. But we'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. But yeah, let's go to page 299. And let's just check out this first verse paragraph here. Starting with 5 years have passed. Can one of you read this for us, please?
I can.
Thank you, Kaylee.
5 years have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters, and again I hear these waters rolling from their mountain springs with a soft inland murmur. Once again do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs that on a wild secluded scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusion and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. The day is come when I again repose here under this dark sycamore and view these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts, which at this season with their unripe fruits are clad in one green hue and lose themselves mid groves and copses. Once again I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of supportive wood run wild, these pastoral farms green to the very door and wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees, with some uncertain notice as might seem of vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods or of some hermit's cave where by his fire the hermit sits alone.
Thank you. So first thing I want to point out is this is actually the place where Tintern, Abbey, and Stairway to Heaven link up. There are a lot of lyrical references in Stairway to Heaven to this part of this poem. The rings of smoke through the trees, the bustle in your hedgerow and all that sort of thing. And this is just going to be a side note. Again, we'll explore a little bit more next week when we talk about the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. But heavy metal bands love romantic poetry. We may be able to come to some conclusions about why next time. But yeah, probably like one of the best known contemporary musical adaptations of a romantic poem is Iron Maiden's version of The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is basically, it's a 20-minute Spark Notes version of the song with an 8-minute bass solo stuck in the middle. So that's fun.
I mean, you can tell that, like, especially like the 80s and 70s rock bands, like Queen, especially with Bohemian Rhapsody, all the mentions of, like, and the references to literature.
Yeah.
Like Beelzebub, like Lord of the Flies, and stuff like that.
Well, I think a lot of that is because, like, frankly, their school system is better than ours is.
Right. Yeah.
So they're
So they actually studied this stuff.
Yeah, they're typically reading more of these things, probably maybe a little more closely in high school, than we frequently do.
Yeah.
They're or at least maybe it's not fair to say their school system is better, but it is more focused on absorbing a particular literary tradition, perhaps at least partly for nationalist reasons, than ours is. But yeah, so we see things like, results of that, like Wordsworth speaking in the cadences of the King James Bible, and Freddie Mercury referencing Lord of the Flies, and a bunch of working class yobs from the East End writing a song about the Ancient Mariner. So Kaylee, you said you noticed this kind of sound theme running through this part of the poem. So can you take us through that?
So I looked, and like in the second line it mentions like him hearing something, and then he talks about like the soft inland murmur, and then he talks about the quiet of the sky, and then it goes and something about like the silence, and even the smoke was silent, and then the other mentions of kind of like being alone with the hermit, or of deep seclusion. So it all kind of connects with the feeling of like, I don't know, tranquility and quiet and calm.
Okay, yeah, and this tranquility and quiet calm kind of related to solitude, right? And we can probably connect this to the discharged soldier as well, because remember, like at the beginning of that poem, before he runs into the soldier, and his thought processes are interrupted by another person. Right? This is the feelings he's having are like this kind of tranquility and solitude, right? He enjoys these nightly walks. And so, oh shit, here's another person, and I have to talk to him. So let's then try to compare these sounds, right? These largely kind of soft and gentle sounds, right? Quiet sounds, to the landscape he describes. What do we notice about the landscape features here in this first paragraph?
Kind of seem to be like pretty majestic things. Like, I mean, it's a mountain, and there's these steep and lofty cliffs.
Steep and lofty cliffs, yes.
So it's kind of interesting that it's all described as being so gentle. Like it can be so impressive and yet so calm.
And what we have here actually is a kind of presentation of the sublime. Right, particularly in these steep and lofty cliffs, and all of these kinds of things, right?
I think you mentioned like sublime somewhere.
Yeah, he uses the word.
Yeah, the word. So they could describe it somewhere.
Yeah, line 37.
But what we have here is kind of a special species of the sublime, right? That is often referred to as the picturesque. And to properly explain this, I probably need to tell you a little bit about the location that Wordsworth is writing about. So I think, we've mentioned that he is walking with his sister in the Wye River Valley, which is on the border between England and Wales. This was and do we get the impression, by the way, that this is a crowded landscape?
No, it seems very vast.
Yeah, it's vast and open, right? Yes, and there's no one there but that hermit sending up his little smoke signals, right? This is total bullshit. The Wye River Valley was actually a really popular tourist walk. So as they're walking up and down these trails, there would have been lots of other pleasure hikers moving along, going the same way, going the opposite way, right? There would have been lots of little boats on the river. So there would have been lots of bustling human activity here. In fact, like the Wye River Valley is the subject of the first illustrated travel book produced in England. It's by a guy by the name of William Gilpin. And it's called Observations on the River Wye. Published in 1782. So about 17 years before Wordsworth publishes this poem. 16 years. This is 1798, right? So yeah, about 16 years before Wordsworth publishes this poem. So he's undoubtedly familiar with Gilpin. This was actually a big bestseller, right? It was a popular travel book. Now, there were a number of local entrepreneurs who actually kind of set up these viewing prospects, whereby you could kind of stand in a safe place and observe from a distance these sublime landscapes, right? So when we talk about the picturesque, right, these were regarded as picturesque views, or they were called picturesque views. What we're talking about is a way of kind of taming the sublime, where you're kind of looking at it through a frame that makes it feel, that reduces that feeling of awe or terror. So to give you an example, I'm going to show you what. Are we going to stay? We are. Good. What Tintern Abbey would have looked like to Wordsworth as he was traveling up and down these trails. And then I'm going to show you a picture of what the Wye River Valley actually looked like at the time Wordsworth wrote this poem. Okay, are we doing anything? Okay, that's the wrong thing.
Compared to the other romantic texts that we've read, it seems like there's a shift in writing, even though it's part of the same period technically.
Yeah.
I guess since this is like late 18th century, beginning of 19th century, it seems like there's a shift from obviously the terror and stuff, more of the awe side of the sublime, like how he's describing the nature and the solitude that he's getting from it, even though you said it's popular.
I think that's a really smart observation. And I think that I think what's going on here is that think about like what happens to you when you're terrified, right? Can you think very effectively when you are frightened? No, right? And romantic writing, romantic poetry is all about thought, right? Documenting the thought process. So yeah, you can't think when you're shit your pants scared. This is very different in purpose from the Gothic, right? Yeah, so we're using our vista of Tintern Abbey, right? Which is like, okay, like I'm standing across the river, probably on a little promontory on a hill, right? That someone has set up, and I'm looking across, and this is a painting, right? But this would be my like a perfectly framed photograph, right? And this is what the picturesque looks like. Here's this ruined medieval abbey that, instead of kind of like standing underneath the flying buttresses and feeling tiny and small and scared, right? I can stand across the river and view it from a safe distance and make it the frame for a beautiful picture, right? Okay, does this make sense, everybody with me?
Yes.
All right. Now this, by the way, is what the Wye River Valley actually would have looked like around the time that Wordsworth was making his trek, right? So what do we notice about this picture?
It is not peaceful at all. I mean, that kind of really ruins this whole description of this lovely land. Like,
yeah, so what do we see here that strikes us as not peaceful?
So many people.
and all the smoke coming out of these
like the
gazillion
cities,
buildings.
like right there.
Yeah, that's the other thing that gets ignored in the poem here, right? That, the Wye River Valley was actually not only heavily trafficked, but heavily industrialized. Right, and so we're talking here, 1798, this is roughly the beginning of the first wave of the British Industrial Revolution. So a lot of these buildings are factories, and they are belching smoke into the air.
These are not the promised cottages that were in this
No, I think that's a good point here. Right? Let's again look at the landscape he describes here. So the natural landscape is those steep and lofty cliffs, right? But there is a man-made landscape here as well. And what does that man-made landscape look like to Wordsworth? If we start from around line 9 down to about line 22. The day is come when I again repose here under this dark sycamore and view these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts, which at this season, with their unripe fruits, are clad in one green hue and lose themselves mid groves and copses. Once again I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood run wild. These pastoral farms, green to the very door, and wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees. This doesn't look like this, right?
Yeah. He made it seem like it was like rural. When I was reading this, I thought it was like a rural place.
Yeah.
They described this is very urban.
Yeah.
The only thing that seems to be truthful is that the green grass goes to the very door.
So the landscape he's describing here is very much kind of in harmony with nature, right? The little hedgerows that separate the farms, they look almost like little sportive forests run wild, right? Like almost kind of untended. And what's the primary color that we see running through all of this? Green. Everything's green, right? And what kinds of things do we associate with green in a context like this?
Trees, plants,
Okay,
foliage.
plants,
Life.
foliage, yes, life. Yeah, so green is a color, we associate. What? Oh, right, it's that the function's not available because it's already turned on. Let's try the off button. There we go. It's like, function's not available. All right. Okay, so we associate green with life, right? And in particular with what stage of life? When, for example, he's talking about green fruits, right?
And they're not ripe, not yet ripe. They're unripe fruit.
Yeah.
There's like a premature version of life.
Yeah, we're talking about kind of what, like early life or like potential life, right?
Yeah, because when you call someone green or say something's green, it's not yet. You don't know.
Yeah, like a green recruit is an inexperienced recruit, right? Now, might this be relevant to someone or something in the poem? Who or what else in the poem might we regard as green?
His sister.
Dorothy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Dorothy Wordsworth is green in that she is as yet inexperienced, right? And so, like that, so we get the unripe potential fruits here, right? Carefully cultivated in their orchards. And at the end of the poem, he is trying to carefully cultivate Dorothy to appear kind of, not receptacle of, but to be a kind of conduit for his own memories, right? It's like bringing her from innocence into experience. With some bloviating about Plato in the middle. So how's this poem working for you now?
Definitely understand it much better. Before, just reading a lot about trees and mentioning blood and stuff like that. I'm like, what am I reading?
Yeah. Well, and that's if you don't have a context for it, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't make a lot of sense.
Right. And then it just jumped to his sister being there. I'm like, okay.
Where did she come from?
Right.
Well, I mean, from the same place he did, Mrs. Wordsworth.
Right.
It definitely does make a lot more sense, but it was also weird, like when he was talking about his sister at the end and talking about like her memory of him, and it almost sounds like he's about to like die in it, like you're going to inherit this and like some of those other words, and so that was like kind of weird to me, like the way that.
Okay, yeah. Can you like take us to a particular spot there that?
So it went. Let me see. I think it started in like lines 140, and then it went on, and so talking about like thy memory be as a dwelling place, and then it talks about like should be thy portion, which means like was the inheritance or the dowry or something.
Okay, yeah.
And then with what healing thoughts of tender joy wilt thou remember me? And like I don't know, it just seems like a little weird. And I think it mentions it like in a couple other ways as well, of like what she would think back on or remember, and I'm like, weird.
I think what he's doing here is presenting himself as a kind of missionary of a particular kind of sense experience, right? Let's kind of maybe take this back a couple sessions to the philosophy behind the idea of sensibility and benevolence, right? This idea of empiricism, because I think it is pretty important to understanding a lot of what's happening in romantic poetry. And we'll kind of wrap it up there because we're getting close to time. By the way, because I'm poorly organized today, I do not have my flash drive with the reading questions, so I'll just email all of those to you for Coleridge. Yes, do y'all remember what an empiricist believes about the world and the way we know it?
Oh, is it like you only know it through experience?
Yes, exactly, yes.
Because the rationalism was the other one, they only the logic.
Yeah, a rationalist believes that the world is organized according to observable principles that you can map out and predict, right? An empiricist believes that the only things we know are things that we gather through our senses, and our senses are not entirely reliable.
Right.
So.
Especially his, he had no sense of smell.
I know, really. That's he's down to 4 out of 5. I think it's.
His eyesight seems to be a little questionable based on the start of the poem too.
Well, I think we have to make allowances for creative license, right? I think that the outside portion of this poem would not have spurred the inside if he had described what he was actually looking at. But the whole idea here, right, is to try to take, to reinvigorate sense impressions that have been dulled by familiarity. To be able to look at something you already know, that you've already seen, through fresh eyes again. And that is actually kind of like one of the big kind of central ideological concerns of Romanticism, right? It's like taking some of these kind of dry, dusty old topics that they feel the neoclassicists have either ignored or ruined, and presenting them in a fresh light. All right, so we're about out of time. Do either of y'all have any questions?
More, not a question, more so a comment.
Uh-huh.
Wait, so back to, I know we related the green to his sister, but him in a way, and then him mentioning his childhood, the way he was describing it and the way that we know that it actually looked, you saying like allowing for like some creative room, like it seems like more he was, you know how a child is, they're more creative, their imagination is more wild.
Yeah.
So he seemed in a way more green in the way that he was describing this.
And
or trying to capture being more green, even though he's seen it before.
And you know, like it's interesting that you make that point. I think we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the semester when we read Goblin Market, the Christina Rossetti poem. But around 1798, right, the idea that there is any such thing as a child is something that's kind of just emerging in European societies, right? That children are in any way different from adults. And I think that Romanticism is a big spur to thinking about children a little bit differently.
Right.
And to thinking about, you know, one thing we're going to talk about, we're going to have to remember, right, is that to the average person up to the Victorian period, right, child labor was a perfectly normal thing, acceptable thing. Right, the idea that children, like most people didn't shed a lot of tears over the idea of children working in factories or going down coal mines or things like that, right?
Right.
Because they didn't regard children as anything other than little adults, especially working class children. But you know, again, like we'll talk about that all that a little bit later. But yeah, you're getting to some of the issues we'll be discussing as we progress through the semester. All right. Any other questions or comments? All right, then you are free to go to surroundings that are more conducive to thought and inspiration.
Right.